Chapter 1: The Project We Built in Silence. I lost my job in one meeting, not because I failed, but because my best friend took credit for my work and stayed silent while I was escorted out of the building. Months later, I sat in the audience of a major industry conference and watched her present the project I built, until one question exposed everything she never understood. My name is Elena Whitmore, and this is the story of how silence cost me my career, and how the truth found its way back. I was 6 years into my career when I learned that visibility mattered more than truth. By then, I had learned how to sit through meetings without speaking, how to take notes while other people took credit, how to make myself useful without making myself visible. I worked at a mid-sized consulting and technology firm in downtown Seattle, the kind of place that liked to call itself collaborative but quietly rewarded whoever spoke last and loudest. The offices were all glass and light, open floor plans meant to signal transparency, even though most decisions were made behind closed doors. My name is Elena Whitmore. I was 34 that year, Senior Project Strategist. That title looked impressive on LinkedIn, but in practice it meant I built the structure that everyone else stood on. Frameworks, roadmaps, risk logic, contingency planning. I was the one people came to when something did not make sense, when a system broke, when leadership wanted answers without wanting complexity. I did not mind working behind the scenes. I never had. I believed the work should speak for itself. That belief was what made everything else possible. Madison Reed sat across from me the day we kicked off the project that would change everything. She was 35, polished, confident, the kind of person who knew how to command a room without sounding aggressive. Project manager, client-facing, the bridge between the team and leadership. We had worked together for years by then, long enough to settle into an easy rhythm. She talked, I built. We had both agreed to it early on. Madison liked presenting. She liked reading a room, adjusting tone, translating complexity into something executives could digest in 5 minutes. I liked structure. I liked logic. I liked knowing that if everything went wrong, there was still a plan that would hold. At least, that is what I told myself. The contract came in early January of 2023, a 14-month strategic engagement with a regional healthcare technology provider looking to scale nationally. It was the biggest project our department had touched in years. Success would mean influence. Failure would mean scrutiny. Daniel Brooks called a meeting the same afternoon the contract was signed. Department director, early 40s, clean suits, measured voice. He spoke about opportunity, about leadership, about trust. Then he looked at Madison and said he wanted her to lead the project. He looked at me and said he wanted me to make sure it succeeded. I nodded. Madison smiled. From day one, the workload was relentless. I built the entire strategic backbone: market analysis, operational sequencing, risk mitigation models, dependencies mapped months in advance. I created the roadmap that tied every deliverable to a decision point. It was the kind of work no one noticed unless it failed. Madison took those materials into meetings with leadership and clients. She presented them cleanly, confidently, always crediting the team as a whole. I never corrected her. I did not feel erased, not yet. Late one night in March, we were reviewing slides ahead of an internal leadership review. Madison had taken my deck and adjusted it. Simplified language, bigger fonts, fewer charts. I noticed something was wrong halfway through. The risk logic had been flattened. A dependency chain I had carefully built to show cascading impact had been compressed into a single bullet. The sequence no longer made sense. It would look fine on screen, but it would fail in practice. I flagged it quietly. "This part breaks the logic," I said, pointing at the screen. Madison frowned, then shrugged. "Executives do not want all that detail. They just need the takeaway." "The takeaway changes if the logic changes," I said. She sighed, glanced at the clock. "We are out of time. Can you just fix it in a way that still looks clean?" I could have pushed back. I did not. I stayed late and rebuilt the slide so the structure held, even in simplified form. Madison thanked me the next morning, distracted, already scanning her calendar. The leadership review went well. Daniel praised clarity. He praised confidence. He praised leadership. He looked at Madison while he said it. When he mentioned me, it was as support. I felt the pause then, the brief internal recalibration. I told myself it didn't matter. Over the next few months, the pattern repeated. Madison asked for final files so she could adjust wording. She asked me to send updated models directly to her instead of uploading them to the shared drive. She framed it as efficiency. I believed her. She was my friend. We grabbed coffee between meetings. We vented about unrealistic timelines. She asked about my mother, about how I was handling things since my father passed. She knew I avoided office politics. She knew I hated confrontation. She told me she had my back. By summer, the project was consuming everything. I skipped dinners, I worked weekends, I stayed late while the office emptied out around me. When things went wrong, people came to my desk. When things went right, Madison went to meetings. In September, there was another internal review. This one bigger. Executive leadership, external stakeholders. I was not invited to the prep meeting. Madison told me it was just a quick alignment session, nothing strategic. I believed her. The next morning, an email went worldwide. The project was highlighted as a model engagement. Madison was named as the leader who had shaped its direction. There was no mention of strategy, no mention of structure, no mention of me. I stared at the screen longer than I should have. When I asked Madison about it, she laughed it off. Probably a mistake. You know how those emails are. Everyone knows you do the heavy lifting. Everyone did not. That was the first time I felt something shift. Not anger, not betrayal, something quieter. A sense that my work was becoming invisible by design. Still, I stayed silent. By December, the project was nearing its most critical phase, implementation planning. Everything I had built would finally be tested. I double-checked assumptions. I documented risks. I sent Madison the final strategic package, clean, comprehensive, ready. She thanked me, told me I was a lifesaver. I went home that night believing the hardest part was over. I believed that because I still thought effort equaled security. I still thought friendship meant loyalty. I still thought that if I kept my head down and my work solid, everything else would fall into place. I did not know yet that my name was already fading from the story being told about the project. I did not know that silence, once chosen, has a way of choosing you back. And I did not know that the foundation I had built so carefully was about to be stood on by someone else. The weeks after that blurred together in a way that felt heavy and sharp at the same time. By January of 2024, the project had moved into its most fragile phase. Everything I had built on paper was being translated into real timelines, real teams, real consequences. The margin for error was thin. The pressure was constant. I started coming in before sunrise and leaving long after the cleaning crew finished their rounds. My calendar filled with blocks labeled deep work, because that was the only way I could protect a few uninterrupted hours. One evening, my mother called while I was still at my desk. She had asked me days earlier to have dinner with her. Nothing special, just a weeknight meal, something normal. I had agreed without checking my schedule, then spent the rest of the day quietly hoping nothing would derail it. When the call came, I was still revising a dependency model for an executive meeting the next morning. I told her I could not make it. I said I was sorry. I said next week. There was a pause on the line, the kind that carried disappointment without accusation. She told me to take care of myself. I promised I would. I hung up and went back to work. That night, I sent Madison the finalized materials for the upcoming leadership meeting, the strategic narrative, the risk logic, the talking points aligned to executive priorities. I flagged a few areas that needed careful framing, the parts where oversimplification could cause problems later. She replied with a thumbs up and a thank you. Nothing more. The next morning, I arrived early, coffee in hand, ready to sit in on the meeting if needed. That was when I noticed the calendar invite. It was already in progress. The meeting room listed was one of the executive suites on the top floor. The attendee list scrolled past my name without stopping. At first, I assumed it was a mistake, an oversight. Someone had forwarded the wrong invite. I checked my email, nothing. I checked the shared calendar, still nothing. I messaged Madison and asked if the meeting had moved. She replied a few minutes later, calm and casual. It was just a quick update, no need for the full team. I stared at the screen longer than necessary. I told myself not to overthink it. Madison had always handled leadership communication. This was not new. Still, something about the timing felt off. I had stayed up half the night preparing materials for a meeting I was apparently not needed in. I went back to my desk and tried to work, but my focus fractured. I kept glancing at the clock, imagining what was being said in that room, what parts of my work were being presented, how they were being framed, whose name was attached to them. An hour later, the meeting ended. People filtered back to their desks, energized, talking in low voices. Madison walked past my desk without stopping, phone already pressed to her ear. That afternoon, an email went out to the entire company. The subject line praised the project as a model of strategic execution. It highlighted leadership, vision, direction. Madison Reed was named as the one who had led the strategic direction from inception through execution. I read the email twice, then a third time. My name did not appear anywhere, not in the body, not in the acknowledgments, not even as part of the broader team credit. I felt something cold settle in my chest. I did not react right away. I sat there, hands folded, breathing evenly. I reminded myself that emails were political documents. They were never complete. I told myself this did not change the work I had done. Still, when I stood up to refill my water, my legs felt unsteady. I waited until the end of the day to talk to Madison. I did not want to confront her in the open. I did not want to make a scene. When I reached her desk, she looked up with a smile, already packing her bag. I asked her about the email. She blinked, genuinely surprised, or at least convincing enough. She said it must have been an oversight. Those messages were often rushed. She said everyone knew I was the one who built the strategy. She told me not to worry. Her voice was warm, familiar, reassuring. I nodded. I told her it was fine. As I walked back to my desk, the reassurance felt thinner with every step. The next few days only sharpened that feeling. More conversations happened without me. Decisions were referenced that I had not been part of. When I asked questions, I was given summaries instead of context. It was subtle, nothing I could point to as a single act of exclusion, just a steady erosion. One afternoon, Sophie Lane stopped by my desk. She was a junior analyst, younger, quieter, still learning how to navigate the unspoken rules of the office. I had mentored her early on, helped her build confidence, encouraged her to speak up in meetings. She looked uncomfortable, shifting her weight as she spoke. She told me she had been in the leadership meeting. I raised an eyebrow. She was usually not included at that level. She said she had been asked to pull data during the session. Then she hesitated, as if deciding whether to continue. She told me that when someone asked about the strategic framework, Madison said she had structured the entire strategy from scratch. The words landed hard. I asked Sophie if she was sure. She nodded. She looked apologetic, like she was delivering bad news she wished she didn't have to share. I thanked her. I told her it was okay. After she left, I sat, very still. There it was. Not an accident, not an omission, a deliberate narrative. I replayed the past year in my mind, the late nights, the revisions, the files sent privately instead of shared, the moments I had chosen silence over correction because it felt easier, kinder, more professional. I realized something then that made my stomach tighten. By not speaking up, I had made it easy for someone else to speak for me. The office didn't feel the same after that. Every interaction carried a second layer of meaning. When Madison praised my work in private, it sounded different. When she summarized decisions in meetings, I noticed which parts she claimed ownership of and which parts she glossed over. I considered confronting her again, more directly this time. I considered going to Daniel. I imagined explaining the situation, laying out the facts. Then I imagined how it would sound. Defensive, emotional, unprofessional. I stayed quiet. The project moved forward. Implementation accelerated. Leadership attention intensified. The stakes grew higher. And with every step, my name drifted further from the center of the story. I understood then that this was no longer about credit, it was about control. The narrative had been taken, and the longer I let it stand, the harder it would be to reclaim. I didn't know yet how much that silence would cost me. I only knew that something irreversible had already begun. Chapter 3. The Day I Was Escorted Out. The first sign that something was wrong came through a Slack message that was not meant for me. It popped up briefly on my screen because someone had replied in the wrong channel, then disappeared. I caught just enough to see the words issue and escalation and timeline before it vanished. A few minutes later, my calendar refreshed. A meeting had been added. Urgent review. Daniel Brooks, Rachel Kim, Madison Reed. My name was on the invite this time. The meeting was scheduled for 30 minutes later. I sat still for a moment, listening to the hum of the office around me, phones ringing, keyboards clicking, someone laughing near the break room. The normal sounds of a workday that had no idea it was about to end something. I opened the project dashboard and scanned for alerts. There it was, a small operational issue flagged in one of the regional rollouts. Not catastrophic, not unexpected, the kind of thing we had planned for months in advance. But as I traced it back, my stomach tightened. The change that caused the issue was not in my framework. It was a late adjustment made after the final strategy had been approved, a simplification, a shortcut, something that had been presented as minor, something I had warned against. I gathered my notes and walked toward the executive wing. My steps felt measured, deliberate. I told myself this was a conversation, not a verdict. The conference room was already occupied when I arrived. Daniel sat at the head of the table, hands folded, expression neutral. Rachel Kim sat to his right, laptop open, posture straight. Madison sat across from them, composed, calm, a printed packet neatly aligned in front of her. She looked up when I entered and gave me a small smile. I took a seat. Daniel began without preamble. He said there had been a concern raised during implementation. He said leadership needed clarity. He said accountability mattered. Rachel nodded along, fingers hovering over her keyboard. Madison spoke next. Her voice was steady, professional. She said the issue appeared to stem from a strategic oversight in the final framework. She said certain dependencies had not been adequately stress-tested. She said the responsibility for that framework rested with me. I felt the air leave my lungs. I leaned forward and tried to speak. I said the change in question was not part of my original strategy. I said the dependency had been flagged as a risk. I said I had documented it. Daniel raised a hand gently. Madison continued. She said that while adjustments had been made, the overall strategic responsibility remained with the architect of the framework. She said that person was me. Rachel looked up from her screen for the first time. She asked if I could provide documentation to support my claim. I reached for my laptop, fingers already moving. The screen behind them remained blank. Madison had brought the deck, her version, the one without my annotations, the one that showed the simplified logic. I felt my voice tighten as I explained. I said the original files were in the shared drive. I said the logs would show the change. Rachel nodded, but her eyes did not soften. She said they were not there to litigate details. She said they were there to assess confidence. Daniel leaned back in his chair. He said trust was essential at this stage of the project. He said leadership needed to feel secure. Madison sat quietly now, hands folded, gaze lowered in what looked like concern. I spoke again. I said the risk had been identified. I said the deviation was not mine. Daniel looked tired. Rachel spoke. She said there had been a pattern of misalignment. She said communication gaps had been noted. She said the situation had eroded confidence in my ability to lead at this level. The word accountability came up again. I realized then that this meeting was not about understanding what happened. It was about deciding who would carry it. Daniel cleared his throat. He said, given the circumstances, the company had decided to terminate my employment effective immediately. The room went quiet. I felt a strange calm wash over me, like my body had stepped away from the moment to protect itself. Rachel slid a folder across the table. She said HR would handle the details. She said security would assist me in collecting my belongings. I looked at Madison. She did not look back. Daniel stood. The meeting was over. A security guard waited outside the conference room. He was polite, apologetic even. He walked a half step behind me as I returned to my desk. People noticed. Conversations paused, screens tilted away. No one spoke. I packed my things slowly. A notebook, a framed photo of my parents, a coffee mug I had brought from home years earlier. Sophie stood a few desks away, eyes wide, unsure whether to approach. I gave her a small nod. She looked like she might cry. The guard offered to carry my box. I declined. As we walked toward the exit, I glanced down the corridor. Madison stood with Daniel and two other leaders. They were talking quietly. She nodded as someone spoke. She did not look at me. Not once. The elevator doors closed behind me. The ride down felt endless. In the lobby, I handed over my badge. The guard thanked me for my cooperation. The glass doors slid open. Outside, the city moved on. Cars passed, pedestrians hurried by. The world did not pause for professional erasure. I stepped onto the sidewalk and stood there, box in my arms, unsure where to go next. I had lost my job in less than an hour. But that was not the deepest loss. What hurt most was the clarity, the realization that the person I trusted had watched it happen and chosen silence, that the narrative had been written long before I entered that room. I walked away from the building slowly, each step taking me further away from the life I thought I was building. Behind me, the office lights glowed, unchanged. Ahead of me, nothing was certain. All I knew was that the career I had poured myself into was gone, and the trust I had placed in someone else had gone with it. Chapter 4: What Silence Builds. The days that followed felt strangely quiet, like the world had lowered its volume without asking me. I woke up the next morning out of habit, reaching for my phone before remembering I had nowhere to be. No calendar alerts, no meetings, no deadlines waiting to punish me for being late. The silence was unsettling, not peaceful. It pressed in on me, forcing me to sit with questions I had avoided for years. I made coffee and stood by the window of my apartment, watching the city move without me. Buses arrived on schedule. People walked with purpose. Somewhere, my former team was already at their desks, opening laptops, continuing a project I had built but would no longer touch. By the end of the first week, the practical worries set in. Severance helped, but not indefinitely. Health insurance timelines, rent, the unspoken fear that I had peaked and been quietly discarded. My mother called every evening. She asked how I was sleeping. She asked if I was eating. She asked if I had thought about what came next. One night, I finally told her what had happened in detail. I described the meeting, the silence, the way the decision had been presented as inevitable. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said softly, "Elena, sometimes it is better not to fight these things. Making noise only makes it harder to move on. You are smart. You will find something else. Just be careful." I knew what she meant. She had spent her career avoiding conflict, surviving by staying agreeable. Her advice came from love, not weakness. Still, something in me resisted it. I did not want to make noise, but I also did not want to disappear. So instead of spiraling, I started documenting. I pulled up my laptop and created a folder. Nothing dramatic, just facts. Emails, versions, timestamps. I traced the evolution of the strategy from its earliest draft to the final implementation plan. I compared my original frameworks with the simplified versions that had been presented. I pulled logs showing when changes were made and by whom. The more I reviewed, the clearer it became. The issue that had triggered my termination had not existed in my work. It had been introduced later, quietly, under the guise of simplification. I was not surprised, but seeing it laid out in front of me did something important. It grounded me. This was not about feelings, it was about evidence. I was not reckless, I was not incompetent, I had not failed. I had been replaced in the story. Weeks passed, the anger faded into something steadier. Focus. I updated my resume carefully. I framed my role without bitterness, without accusation. I practiced explaining my departure in a way that sounded neutral, even though it was not. Then one afternoon, my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. I let it go to voicemail. When I listened to the message, I froze. It was Noah Alvarez. He introduced himself as the external partner who had worked closely with our team during the engagement. He said he hoped I was doing well. He said he had a few questions and wondered if I might be open to talking. I called him back. We spoke for nearly an hour. He did not ask why I had left the company. He asked about the strategy. He asked about dependencies. He asked about assumptions that no longer seemed to be holding. At one point, he paused. "I have to be honest," he said. "Something is not lining up anymore. The answers we are getting do not reflect the depth of the original plan." I felt a quiet confirmation settle in my chest. He told me the current project lead struggled to explain decisions that once were clear. He told me leadership was getting nervous. He told me the team was improvising where there used to be structure. And every time we ask a deeper question, he added, your name comes up. We scheduled another call, then another. I began answering questions again, not as an employee, not as a subordinate, just as someone who knew the work. I did not reach out to my former company. I did not warn them. I did not offer help unsolicited. I simply responded when asked. Word spread quietly. Another partner contacted me, then a former client from a different engagement. Conversations turned into short consulting requests. A few hours here, a review there. I registered as an independent consultant and built a simple website. No branding campaign, no announcement. Just my name and my work. One afternoon, Sophie messaged me. She asked if we could grab coffee. She told me things were tense at the office, that leadership was frustrated, that timelines were slipping, that Madison seemed overwhelmed. She said, "I thought you should know. People are starting to ask different questions now." I thanked her. I did not feel triumphant. I felt calm. This was not revenge, it was gravity. The absence of real understanding always reveals itself eventually. By the time spring arrived, my calendar was full again, not with meetings that drained me, but with work that respected my time and my expertise. I worked from my dining table, from quiet cafes, from my apartment, sunlight spilling across the floor as I explained systems I had once been paid to hide behind someone else. I was careful, professional, grounded. I did not speak badly about anyone. I did not need to. The truth was doing its work without me pushing it. One evening, after a long day of calls, I sat alone and realized something had shifted. I was no longer trying to reclaim what I had lost. I was building something else, something that belonged to me. And for the first time since I walked out of that building with a box in my arms, I felt steady. Not vindicated, just steady. I did not know how the story would end yet, but I knew I was no longer waiting for permission to continue it. Chapter 5. When Credit Finds Its Way Home. By the time the invitation arrived, my life no longer revolved around proving anything. It came through email on a quiet afternoon in late fall, an invitation to speak at a national industry conference scheduled for early 2025. The kind of event I used to attend as background support, sitting in the audience while someone else presented my work. This time, the message addressed me directly. Independent consultant, subject matter expert. I read it twice before replying yes. In the weeks leading up to the conference, I prepared carefully, not out of anxiety, but out of respect for the work. I reviewed notes, updated examples, refined how I explained systems that had grown more complex since I last touched them. I focused on clarity, on substance, on answering questions honestly, even when the answers were not neat. When I arrived at the venue, the space buzzed with familiar energy. Glass walls, registration lines, conversations overlapping in hotel corridors, people exchanging business cards with practiced smiles. I checked the agenda. Madison Reed was listed as a speaker on the first morning panel, representing my former company, presenting the very project that had ended my career there. I felt a brief tightening in my chest, not fear, recognition. I took my seat in the audience, notebook resting on my lap. Madison walked onto the stage moments later, polished as ever, confident posture, controlled smile. She spoke about leadership, about execution, about strategic alignment. The language was smooth, familiar. When the moderator opened the floor for questions, hands went up immediately. The first few were surface level, timelines, resourcing, metrics. Madison handled them well. Then the questions shifted. Someone asked about dependency management under scale pressure. Another asked how the framework adapted when regional variables conflicted. Madison paused. She answered, but the response drifted, high level, abstract. She spoke around the logic instead of through it. More questions followed, deeper ones. The room grew quieter. I watched as she adjusted her stance, glanced briefly at the moderator, searched for footing that was no longer there. The words kept coming, but they did not land. The structure beneath them was missing. I did not feel satisfaction, I felt a strange calm. The ended with polite applause. Later that afternoon, it was my turn to speak. I walked onto the stage without thinking about Madison at all. I spoke about systems, about trade-offs, about the importance of respecting complexity instead of flattening it for convenience. I answered questions directly. When I did not know something, I said so. When an answer was uncomfortable, I explained why. The same questions Madison had struggled with came up again. This time, they found their shape. I saw heads nodding, pens moving, the quiet focus of people being given clarity instead of performance. I never mentioned the project by name. I did not reference my former company. I did not correct anyone. I did not need to. Afterward, people approached me, some to ask follow-up questions, some to thank me for explaining what had been confusing all day. A few mentioned the earlier panel, carefully, without judgment. I smiled and listened. That evening, back in my hotel room, my phone buzzed with messages, contacts from the conference, new inquiries, old names resurfacing. A week later, Sophie called. She told me the conference had stirred things up back at the office. Leadership had questions, clients had concerns. Madison had been reassigned to internal work. The big strategic projects were being handled elsewhere now. No announcement, no confrontation, just a quiet redirection. I thanked Sophie and hung up. I sat with the information longer than I expected, not to savor it, but to understand how little it changed how I felt. There was no rush of victory, no sense of justice served, just confirmation. Over time, my work continued to grow, slowly, intentionally. I chose projects that valued depth over display. I said no more often. I built a practice that fit my life instead of consuming it. Sometimes people asked about my old company. Sometimes they asked about Madison. I answered neutrally, briefly, without resentment. The truth did not need embellishment. Looking back now, I see that the hardest part was never losing the job. It was losing my voice before I lost my title. I learned that silence can protect you, but it can also erase you. That credit does not always come when you deserve it, but it has a way of finding its way home if the work is real. If you have ever watched someone else stand on what you built and wondered if it would matter in the end, I want to hear from you. Have you stayed silent when you should have spoken, or spoken when silence felt safer? Share your thoughts in the comments and stay with me. There are more stories ahead about resilience, clarity, and what happens when you stop waiting for permission to take up space.